I think really being able to lead yourself first before you step out there and you tackle and you take on this idea of leading others would be hugely helpful because, in my dealings, and I talked to a lot of leaders over these, last many, many years, but in particular, at least the last 6 months. And I found those that seem to be the most successful have a doggedness about them. They have this ability to say, you know what, I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. And I'm going to make sure that my workforce is okay. And they put the effort into being positive, and they put the effort into looking forward, and they put effort into making sure that they coach those employees through whatever it is that's going on around them. Those are the ones that I'm finding seem to be able to take a lot of things in stride and seem to be able to keep their workforces motivated and keep their missions moving forward.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. This week's episode explores the evolving state of the federal workforce, its challenges, opportunities, and the path forward in a time of change and increasing demands on public service. Our guests today are two nationally recognized leaders in federal human capital management. Angela Bailey and Jeffrey Neal are both former Chief Human Capital Officers at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, with decades of experience overseeing strategic workforce planning, recruitment, performance management, and employee development for one of the largest federal departments. Welcome to you both. Let's begin with a broad view. What do you see as the most pressing challenges facing the federal workforce today? And how have those evolved over the past decade? And importantly, how has that evolution accelerated in the past 6 months? Angie, maybe we start with you.
I think over the last decade, at least, what I witnessed a lot of was this idea of kind of using the federal workforce as a political football. Seemed to be a little bit more pronounced in the last 10 years. I think in these last 6 months, things have been quite different for the federal workforce with regard to not only the speed and the pace of which things are being done, but also the level at which the administration has gone in and made some of the changes that it's made.
Jeff, what are your thoughts?
I would agree with Angie that clearly federal employees have been used as a political football. I would argue that's probably gone back a lot longer than 10 years. And it's something that I think has changed pretty dramatically in the last 6 months. Before we had, clearly when we had a Republican administration, we would have, the more conservative Republican small government approach to the federal workforce. When we had Democratic president, then we would have more focus on the employees and more focus on equity. So that was kind of normal. We would see that back and forth, and we expected that. People, expect that you're going to get different results with Democrats and Republicans. With Trump 2.0, what we're seeing is something that's much more radical, and it's really not something that fits neatly into a Democratic or Republican point of view. My view in working with Republican administrations in the past has been they tended to be very business-like. But no one would run a business the way the Trump administration started downsizing the government without really a lot of analysis or forethought. It was just, invite in Elon Musk and let him, take a chainsaw to the place. That's not really a Republican approach. It's not really a Democratic approach. It's a new way of doing business. And clearly that's been problematic because, we've seen employees run out of town, and then we've seen agencies going back to those same employees, asking them to come back. We've seen people invited to leave, and then before they left, they were invited to stay, and because there hadn't been enough planning put into the downsizing. And it's not that I don't think the federal government could be downsized. I think you could probably easily take 10 or 15 or 20% out of the federal workforce if you did it smartly, if you did it by analysis of where we had overlapping responsibilities, where we had agencies that had, does an agency need 25 different HR offices spread around the agency, for example? My argument would be no. So I think you certainly could reduce the size of the federal workforce. And I do think that even though I don't agree with the way the Trump administration's done it, people talk about losing 10% of the federal workforce like that is a tragedy that, of immense proportions. And my God, how could the federal government survive with 10% less employees? Keep in mind that if you take 10% out of the federal workforce, it takes us all the way back to where we were in the old days in, say, 2021. It's not exactly like we've taken the federal workforce down to record low levels. There's still 2 million federal employees, and the federal workforce has actually grown quite a bit during the Biden administration. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying things have changed and they've gotten very interesting.
If we're just taking these last 6 months, there's so much change and so much downsizing and shifts of mission and things like that we've all thought about for many years, right? A lot of this stuff isn't kind of new. It's the method in which it's being done it's surprising on one hand. Like, if you were to ask me before the administration came in, I would have said, this isn't going to happen. Like, I don't know what we're worried about because, everybody talks a good game all the time and then nothing ever really happens. In this particular case, it happened. It happened at really rapid speed. So on one hand, while it hurts my heart to see really good people get impacted by this in a negative way, on the other hand, as a long-term federal employee, and more importantly, as an American taxpayer, I don't necessarily disagree with some of the findings and some of the downsizing and some of the streamlining and different things that this administration is going after. So, I kind of see it from both sides, right? And I think, Jeff, that's kind of what you're saying too, is like, none of us really are going to disagree with it. I think the one thing that is interesting or would be interesting is if they would have taken a measured approach, right? And if they would have taken an approach in which, that they analyzed it and all that, my prediction is nothing would have got done, right? It wouldn't have gotten done at the rate that it's getting done now because we've seen this story play out multiple times. And it's, whether it's a special interest or a contractor or a lobbyist or a specific congressman or woman, like somebody always steps in, right, to stop some of the efficiencies and some of the things that we were often trying to accomplish.
The naysayers always say nay.
Right.
And they do try to stop any kinds of changes. I do think, though, if this administration wanted to do it in a more thoughtful and judicious way, they could have, and they actually would have had enough support on the Hill to implement things. And they probably would have been far more successful at it. Because if right now, if you try to go out and sell what they've done to a fair amount of the public, it's viewed as haphazard, poorly thought out, not very well done. If they had taken even 3 months and done some quick analysis and then did it, I think it would have probably been viewed by the public as something very positive. Reducing the size of the federal workforce, saving some money, and doing it in a thoughtful and reasonable way. So it could have been done. I do think it could have been done and implemented still far quicker than normal. But I agree with Angie that the naysayers frequently try to stop anything. And you have to be careful when you start doing analysis that you actually do a real solid analysis. I know at DLA, when we were doing our HR transformation there, I was asked, even though I was given approval by the agency director to do what I wanted to do, he said, well, let's go ahead and just get a study done so we have something on paper in case somebody asks us later why we did this. He said, but don't stop doing what you're doing. So we did. We went out and hired a contractor. They came in and then they gave us a report. It took like 6 months to get it. And it said that what we planned to do wouldn't work, that we were going to be understaffed and we wouldn't be able to deliver the services. That was probably within a month or two of us having completed the project and saving 28% of our cost and taking our average fill time from 110 or 115 days down to about 62 days. So the contractor was totally wrong, as contractors frequently are, because they're incredibly cautious. They don't want to go into an agency and say, wow, you need to take some real risks, because then they think they'll get blamed if those risks turn out to be a little too risky. I think that analysis is a very good thing, but you don't do it the way it's frequently done in Washington, which is bring in the contractors, let the contractors take forever, give them a lot of money, and then have them give you a milquetoast recommendation that doesn't involve any risk at all. And anybody who tells you that you can make radical changes to an organization with no risk is delusional. And if you want to do something that is not risky at all, you're likely to get very little payoff out of it, because the things that are not risky at all generally don't involve significant change.
It sounds like the debate is still open as to whether this new way of doing business was an absolutely necessary approach to achieving some of this change. No argument that it's a period of massive disruption and that it's an environment that many didn't expect to find themselves in, but it does come with some opportunity to reform the federal workforce. You're both talking about there's been a need for that for some time. Talk about now, how do you modernize a workforce? How do you help the workforce acclimate to new expectations and norms? How do you help build new skills? And then how do you help some transition to new roles if their talents are better used elsewhere? You're both talking about that there's an opportunity for this, but what does that look like in practice?
I think what it looks like is recognizing the approach that the Republicans have taken and the approach that the Democrats have taken has primarily been viewed through a partisan lens. Democrats want to protect the unions and want to protect the workforce, even though there may be instances where we have employees we don't really need anymore. The Republicans tend to want to cut it. And they both view it through a partisan lens. And I'm sick of looking at the federal workforce through a partisan lens, because federal workforce is made up mostly of very dedicated people who come in and do good work and care about the mission, care about the oath of office they took to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Most of the federal workforce, the vast majority, are very, very dedicated people who do great work. There are people who are not so dedicated and who don't do great work. And getting them out of the federal government is damn near impossible. We can fire people, and we fire people every year. But the reality is every one of us who's worked in a federal agency has worked with people who you wonder why on earth they're still there. And instead of firing them, because it's too hard to do that, they end up getting just bounced around, and they sometimes even get promoted and never do a damn bit of work. So I think what we need is some significant civil service reform. It needs to be much easier to hire people. The Academy has a paper up on its website about how to simplify hiring by modernizing veteran preference. I happen to have written that paper, but it's one of the better ones on the NAPA website. So we need to simplify hiring, and we also need to simplify moving people out of the workforce who have no business being there anymore. And I think there are some models out there that we could look at. I have a blog post coming out basically recommending that we adopt something similar to the Tennessee model, where Tennessee did a significant reform of their civil service system and where they combined aspects of a merit-based civil service protected workforce and some aspects of at-will employment. I thought when I started looking at this whole issue of how states had done it, that we would find that the ones who had gone to something that was either at will or a mix of at will and traditional protections, that we would find a lot of problems. It turns out in several of the states, including most notably Tennessee, it hasn't been a problem at all. It's actually worked out extremely well. And even the employee groups have liked what they did. And the fact that employees don't have to sit there and do double work because Betty Lou sitting next to them hasn't done any work in the last 10 years and nobody's got the backbone to get rid of Betty Lou. So I think that's what we need. I was a Democratic administration appointee, but I disagree with the people who say that if the Democrats get back in power, what they should do is try to get everything back to where it was. Because the American people, I think, were kind of tired of where it was. That's the reason they elected someone who was promising pretty radical change. I don't think we need to go back to the way things were. We need to go forward and design a federal workforce and federal workforce programs that are suitable for this century and this millennium, and not something that was designed 70 years ago for a workforce that was primarily clerical. A very different workforce in a very different environment in a very different country now.
Let's move beyond politics. We've talked about hiring, we've talked about performance management, firing, and a lot of change. Angie, in addition to leading human capital efforts at the Department of Homeland Security, you're also a former chief operating officer at the Office of Personnel Management. What's the role of a chief human capital officer at a federal agency? And what role does OPM play in working with agencies and leading the overall federal workforce?
I really think that from an OPM perspective, my goal was always to figure out every way that we possibly could to help the agencies get to yes. Be able to do some of the things that Jeff was talking about, whether it was being up on the Hill, talking to Congress, trying to figure out a way to get some of the legislations changed, whether it was working with our own attorneys and trying to figure out how to relax some of the regulations that we had done. If you really look at like the basic of how you hire and stuff, it's incredibly frustrating how many rules and regulations were laid on top of the original legislation, right? Like when it says, we'll have fair and open competition, it didn't say that it had to be by USA Jobs. That was built in later on. It didn't say, that you had to have certain assessments or a veteran's preference had to be applied. And all these different things just started mounting on over and over. Some of it is a result of lawsuits. Some of it was a result of special interest groups, in particular the unions. And, and some of it was just people being afraid. And I would say over my career, even now I'll switch gears into being a chief human capital officer, the number one thing was really just helping agencies stop being afraid to do what they need to do to be able to get their job done. Even to this day, I'm still doing some consulting work with some agencies, and it still blows me away how many agencies have put so many rules and regulations in place that cause them not to be able to be efficient, that cause them not to be able to do some of the things that they want to do, whether it's, hiring at a much quicker pace, whether it's making sure that they have the right talents and skills, not only within the agency, but that they can acquire them into the agency. So much of this we have done to ourselves. So when we're out and about and we're thinking of ways that we want to reform civil service or we want to move the ball forward, I just saw my role at both OPM and as the CHICO was to figure out how do you take all of this complexity that we have to work with? How do you boil it down, make it as simple as possible, peel away everything that doesn't make sense, that we shouldn't be doing or don't need to do, that we've done to ourselves, so that we could make the kind of progress that was intended. That again, those were both of my roles. I saw them kind of overlapping each other. I'm glad I had the experience at OPM before I went to DHS. It was certainly extremely helpful, especially because I was the chief operating officer. So having IT and acquisition and finance under me, as well as HR, security, safety, et cetera, I think it helped give me a fuller picture of what was needed, or at least who I needed to partner with once I got to DHS to be able to implement some of our innovative programs.
You've both talked about a system that needs to change. You've talked about rules that are actually barriers and not helping to advance towards a workforce and a government able to deliver services as it should. And you've also talked about how the current administration has taken some action towards that. But maybe more, if you can, talk about what does good performance management look like? What does the future federal workforce look like if we get it right? And perhaps what needs to happen to make sure that we get there?
I think it's only about 3% of the workforce is 3% of the workforce is never going to get it, right? And it doesn't matter what rules or regulations or anything else that we have in place, they're going to do what they're going to do, and we're going to have to deal with them. What we never seem to ever talk about or deal with is the 97% of the workforce that comes to work, does a really good job, believes in the mission. Sometimes some of the things that I really want to do is turn this argument around and say, what is it that we're going to do to help the 97%? And it might even be higher than that. But even private sector, it's around 3%. It's not like, that they've got this mass market on perfect employees either. They deal with all the same stuff that we deal with as well. They might just have a little bit easier time of getting rid of them, but of those employees than we do. But when we talk about how are we going to make sure that this workforce that we currently have on hand, how are we going to make sure that they have the skills that we need, that they understand the mission or at least the direction in which we're headed in, that they have the resilience that they're going to need? Being in the federal government, especially at the SCS level, was like being in the NFL. They hit hard. Okay. It's not T-ball. And so I think that really where we need to concentrate our efforts and put our time and energy into is that percentage of the workforce, which is the vast majority of it, that really wants to carry out the mission on behalf of the American public. People don't like the federal government, in particular the federal employees, till they need them, right? So nobody really likes FEMA until they really need FEMA. Nobody really, thinks about the Coast Guard until they need the Coast Guard. But when the American public really needs them, they're there for them. I'd really love to have more conversations around what do we need to do to help bring all those entities together so that collectively we can deliver what we need to deliver. Because the federal workforce isn't delivering it on its own. It's definitely a team sport.
Yeah, I think agencies like that with FEMA, I think people's fondness for FEMA is directly proportional to the depth of the water in their house. And when you've got when you've got 3 feet of water in your living room, all of a sudden FEMA looks pretty darn good. Right. And you're wondering when you're going to get the help that FEMA can offer. People need to be more aware of the good that the federal government does. But, if you get back to your question on performance, part of the problem with performance is that performance management is a very difficult thing to do. And people don't do it very well in the private sector. People say, we should do it more like the private sector. Well, the private sector does the same kind of crap the government does. It's not very good. You tend to overrate people. And I found in the federal government that performance management is very one-sided. We are very good at telling employees what we expect of them. We're not very good at telling them what we will do for them to help facilitate performance. And performance is supposed to be a discussion, not a lecture. And I would much rather see us having discussions with employees and saying, okay, here's what we expect for you to do. And here are the resources available to help you do that.
Well, Jeff, what gives you hope for the future of public service? And what advice would you give to human capital professionals and to those considering a career in government today if they wanted to address a lot of what you've talked about and really make a difference for the American public?
Well, the thing that gives me hope for the future of public service is public servants. Right now, the federal workforce is getting beat up pretty badly by the Trump administration, and they have their reasons for doing it. But it's they're getting a lot of grief right now. Yet those folks are showing up for work, and they are still serving the American people, and they still care about their missions, and they still care about the Constitution, and they still want to be public servants. And to me, that's very encouraging that we still have a lot of people who are very dedicated to the work they do. I know in the years I spent in the Department of Defense, people there it was mission. We're going to focus on the mission. And I remember after the September 11th attacks, people were told the next day, don't come to work. You don't have to come to work. You can take the day off. And at DLA headquarters, when I got there, because I went to work that day, there was a huge line of cars trying to get through security at the gate because all these people who were told you could stay home and have a free day off showed up for work. So if they wanted to send a strong message that you can't intimidate us into not coming to work and doing our job, because they cared about the mission. And that's what gives me hope. I think there are a lot of people, and it's not just in the Department of Defense, who deeply care about the missions of their agency and about serving the American people. And I think they will continue to do that as long as they are allowed to do it.
And Angie, my last question to you, it's very clear that the success of the federal workforce depends on good leadership. What makes a great federal leader today? And how can agencies cultivate leadership at all levels going forward?
I think today the answer lies in your ability to make sense out of chaos, right? And it's not just about today. I think those leaders who understand how to be able to regulate their own emotions, who can look out and they can see all the pieces and the patterns and the parts and everything that's going on around them. And they can coalesce all of that into a succinct message, and they can deliver that to their workforces, or that they can run an interference or be a bumper guard, whatever word you want to use, between the career workforce and perhaps the political leadership, depending on where you are within an organization, right? But speaking mostly to those that are in the DC area and for the leaders that are in that area, I think really being able to lead yourself first before you step out there and you tackle and you take on this idea of leading others would be hugely helpful. Because, in my dealings, and I talked to a lot of leaders over these, last many, many years, but in particular, at least the last 6 months. And I found those that seem to be the most successful, that are still working, within the federal government, and they seem to be the most successful, it's not a Pollyanna attitude, right? But they have a doggedness about them. They have this ability to say, you know what, I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. And I'm going to make sure that my workforce is okay. And they put the effort into being positive, and they put the effort into looking forward, and they put effort into making sure that they coach those employees through whatever it is that's going on around them. Those are the ones that I'm finding seem to be able to take a lot of things in stride and seem to be able to keep their workforces motivated and keep their missions moving forward. So that really, I think, is what I see from a leadership standpoint. Is we got to learn to lead ourselves first, before we're that old, that saying, you put your mask on first, right? Before you put it on your kids on the plane kind of thing. It's really that kind of thing. And I'm not saying this is all woo-woo and you got to sit around and meditate and all that. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about our ability to get in touch with ourselves as leaders, understand who we are, understand our emotions, understand what makes us react or what pushes our buttons and stuff, and then learn how to regulate that so that you can create an environment in which people are at least calm or calmer than perhaps they want to be. We went through this even during COVID, that at least that's what I experienced, right? It was completely out of control. We didn't really know which direction to go in. There was stuff going on all over the place. And those, again, who were most successful during that COVID timeframe were those leaders that were able to harness it all in, keep it under control, and then could be there for their employees because they were already there for themselves.
Many may not know it, but the federal workforce does so much for our country and generally delivers when it matters most. While it can always be better and it's needed reform for some time, we have an opportunity ahead with the current administration. We just heard that the approach to that reform matters, but it is time to reimagine how our government can serve us. Thanks to our guests, Jeffrey Neal and Angela Bailey, for joining us.
Thank you.
I did go ahead.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie Alwan and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.